All right, welcome back to the fiction of Planescape. Among the Planescape novels, I'll start with the unofficial rather. I'll start with the unofficial Planescape novel, Fire and Dust by James Allen Gardner, who you can see here. This book was probably written around the same time as the first four official Planescape novels, which were published in 1996-97. Gardner has said that he finished Fire and Dust in June 1995. He's also said, this is a quote from Gardner, "I wrote Fire and Dust because I fell in love with the Planescape setting in Dungeons and Dragons. This is a silly thing for a professional writer to do without a contract in hand, so it goes. The novel wanted to be written and I had a good time writing it." Gardner submitted the novel to TSR, but it was rejected, so he uploaded it to the internet, the web, where it circulated freely and was even translated into other languages, and the rest is history. But the thing about the novel is that you can tell Gardner had a good time doing it. Of all the Planescape novels, and perhaps of all the D&D novels that I've read, Fire and Dust is maybe the most fun to read. I even read it to my son when he was 8 years old, and when it was over, he asked if there was a sequel. So it's a likable book. It's a fun book. In some ways, Fire and Dust is subversive for a D&D novel, and this is probably why it was rejected by TSR. But there's another way in which it's perhaps even the best representation in fiction of the Planescape setting, and I'll talk a little bit about why later on. But purely for that reason, even if the chronology is a little bit hard to suss out, it's a good way to begin this novel. And all the images I'm going to show, by the way, at least all the art that I'm going to show, is by fans of the novel, because there's no official art for it. And I'll mention the artists in the description. Just want to mention that. So why do I say that Fire and Dust is subversive? The novel is subversive in its plot, its characters, and its emotional tone. I think we can talk about those things. The plot, the characters, and the tone of the novel. Now, on one level, the plot is a typical fantasy plot. The heroes go on a quest to track down a magical item and defeat a great evil. This is the plot of like 90% of fantasy novels, right? There's usually some magical item like a ring or a sword or a magical book. And there's usually some big evil character like a powerful wizard or a dragon or some kind of fiend lord or something. In this case, though, in the case of Fire and Dust, the magical item and the great evil are, I think, intentionally ridiculous. So here's the plot in more detail. So what has happened is that a scion, and I'll explain scions in a moment, a scion with a massive chip on her shoulder has discovered the existence of a pair of magical devices that can control the flow of magical energy. To understand what I just said, you probably need to know that in D&D there are various ways to perform supernatural feats. Probably the most typical are arcane and divine magics, as in wizards and clerics, is one kind of supernatural activity. Another way to do kind of some similar things is psionics, Psionics. Psionics is not a form of magic, but of mental discipline, which allows you to perform feats of telepathy and telekinesis and things like that. Read minds, control thoughts, all of that. The villain in Fire and Dust is a scion named Rivi. Artist representation there. Rivi is a sexy albino who wears garish makeup and apparently talks in a Scottish accent. One of her quirks is describing everything as we. Well, the villain is a bit much, I think. Practically a cartoon. In fact, I kind of imagine her as Cruella de Vil from Disney's 101 Dalmatians. She's as flamboyantly stylish, vindictive, and emotionally shallow. Makes you wonder whether Rivi is meant to be a parody of the typical fantasy villain. Or maybe Gardner's just having some fun. Anyway, Rivi is trying to steal and eventually succeeds in stealing a pair of powerful devices. These devices happen to look like simple salt and pepper shakers, but they each produce an infinite supply of dust grinders. I think they call them Gardner calls them in the book. And one kind of dust clings to a magic user and causes their magical energy to combust. If you try to cast a spell with this anti-magic dust on you, you burst into flame, which happens in the book. The other kind of dust made by the other dust grinder, counteracts the first kind. Rivi wants to spread the anti-magic dust throughout the planes so she can rule the multiverse, or some such thing like that. The plot is actually the least interesting part of the novel, but it's there. It's necessary in a way as a sort of scaffold, which allows Gardner to bring together a really interesting group of protagonists and to place these protagonists in a series of highly complex set pieces and exotic locations. I'll mention a few of these as we go. Now, often in D&D, in a D&D novel, there's a main protagonist who gathers around himself or herself a small group of companions, and Dungeons & Dragons is, of course, a cooperative or a party-based game. The hero here in Fire and Dust is Britlin Cavendish. Britlin Cavendish seen here with a painting. So Britlin Cavendish, for my money, is one of the great fantasy heroes, rather than being, and it's kind of the contrast that makes him interesting. So rather than being typically heroic himself, Britlin is actually the son of a typical fantasy hero. So Britlin's father is the renowned adventurer Niles Cavendish, who spent most of Britlin's childhood going off on adventures throughout the plains until one day he simply didn't come back. Britlin's mother is one of the women Niles Cavendish rescued on one of his adventures, in that case from an abusive uncle. And in fact, this undercurrent of paternal absenteeism, we might call it, and sexual abuse and even incest is what elevates Fire and Dust beyond a standard D&D adventure story. Although this also likely made the novel unpublishable by TSR. But on the other hand, it gives, I think, an emotional depth to the character of Britlin that is unusual in genre fiction like this. Too often, the characters in fantasy novels are little more than names on paper, to which some identifying physical attributes are attached, like sparkling blue eyes or flowing brown hair or a gleam cloak, etc., etc. Britlin, in contrast, to me at least, has the weight of reality about him. He's urbane and witty on the surface, but you come to realize that his public personality is partly a manifestation of and a compensation for submerged pain and rage. Britlin's love interest and quest companion, Yasmin, also escapes being a fantasy genre stereotype in this way. Britlin and Yasmin are set up to be opposites in terms of their surface characteristics. Britlin's faction in Sigil is the Society of Sensation, the Sensates. He seeks out new experiences for their own sake. And I think in the second and third videos in this series, I said a little bit about factions. Yasmin's faction is the Doom Guard. She's a guardian of entropy. A later Planescape book, actually, Faction War, one of the game books, not a novel, but it notes that the Doom Guard and the Sensates are natural opposites. The Sinkers, the Doom Guard, relish the decay of the multiverse, while the Sensates live for experiencing all the cosmos has to offer. So they're seemingly opposites. But it's not just their factions. Britlin is a kind of a hack painter and a wit. He takes painting commissions in Sigil for rich people who want things to look a certain way. So he's kind of a hack, and there's one of the interesting things for me in the novel is this discussion about what is real art. But anyways, Britlin is kind of this hack painter. He's a joker. Yasmin, on the other hand, is serious and moody. Yet, Britlin and Yasmin have similar emotional cores, carrying around the weight of their difficult pasts, I've mentioned Britlin's absent father and abused mother. Yasmin doesn't even know who her father was and was abused by her own brother. Incidentally, Yasmin is the first example we have of a persistent Planescape trope, something that you see again and again in Planescape fiction, which is the tiefling love interest. Now, the race of tieflings were created, or was created, the race was created by Zeb Cook, David Zeb Cook, who created the Planescape setting. He created tieflings specifically for the Planescape setting. Tieflings are the result of humans mixing with fiends. Think of them as devils or demons. They're basically human. Tieflings are basically human, but usually have some non-human features, such as horns or wings or a tail, something like that. And pretty much, and all Planescape novels, I was going to say pretty much, but it's actually an absolute in this case, all Planescape novels have a tiefling love interest. It's an iron law of Planescape romance. Tieflings as a race have a certain attraction in this setting, you must admit. Zeb Cook described them in this way. So this is how Zeb Cook described tieflings. He says, part human and part something else. Tieflings are the orphans of the plains. Tieflings live with both pride and shame of who and what they are. They have no culture of their own, and most are loners. Some slip into the edges of human society, becoming poets and artists who describe the corrupt fringes of the respectable world. Adventurous types often spend their years probing the unexplored edges of the multiverse, be it to survey strange lands or experiment in the forgotten niches of magical science. A tiefling learns early that life is unfair and hard. His reaction is to fight back and never let his foes see the pain. Or her, right? McComb and Cook's Hellbound describes them as lonely and bitter. They're the alienated outsiders of Planescape. And as in a movie like Rebel Without a Cause, there's a certain kind of person who finds that attractive, as in the heroes of the Planescape novels. Although Britlin comes from a respectable family, he has just enough darkness in his background to be drawn to Yasmin. All right, now back to the plot of the novel and the writing style and techniques. So the characters are one strength of the novel. The other strength, one of the other strengths anyway, is Gardner's ability to place these characters into these really intricate catastrophes, or these situations that are absurd but also somehow logical. Especially memorable to me are Britlin and Yasmin's fall through a collapsing building in Sigil, the party's fight against a horde of zombies or undead kind of creatures in two of Rivi's thieves in the gate town of Plague Mort, a battle on a burning tower of aquariums known as the Vertical Sea in Sigil, and the destruction of a giant mechanical spider on the quasi-elemental plane of dust. Gardner's eye for chaotic detail would have made him a fine director of disaster movies. And Gardner's ear for the comedic and the absurd is just as skillful, just as refined. In Carceri, this is one of the kind of underworld levels, Yasmin and Britlin meet a boatman who needs a series of portraits repainted on the side of his boat. Various fiends in the vicinity propose these innovative and ostentatious murals to put on the side of his boat, but the boatman just wants a simple copy job. Finally, these are the words of the novel, Yasmin stepped forward and tapped the boatman on the shoulder. "Sir," she said, above the noise of the fiend's departure, "you don't need an artist, you need a hack. Let me introduce the most unrepentant hack in the multiverse." To which Britlin's narration adds, "I tried my best to look modest." But perhaps the scene I recall most often is Britlin and two of his male companions attempting to escape Sigil's madhouse with an elderly orc inmate who believes Britlin and friends are princes who've come to marry her. Their attempt to bypass a couple of puzzled madhouse guards devolves into a discussion about whether or not marrying 3 princes at once makes you a queen. But humor and hijinks aside, Fire and Dust is in many ways the best fictional representation of Planescape. Why do I say that? Well, first, the novel is largely set in the city of Sigil. If you don't know about Sigil, I've mentioned that in previous videos. And Sigil is a fascinating location in its own right, and well described in the novel. But the novel also describes travel to several other planes. We visit the quasi-elemental plane of dust, the lower plane of Carceri, the gray wastes in the middle of the lower planes, the Sea of the Drowned in the astral plane, the plane of infinite portals, aka Pazunia, at the top of the abyss, the gate town of Plagmort, and Shekenester's Court of Light, the serpent god Shekenester's Court of Light. The novel also introduces, well, I think, several of Sigil's factions. Many residents of Sigil belong to a faction, basically a group united by a common worldview. Britlin, as I mentioned earlier, is a sensate, a member of the Society of Sensation. This faction, as I mentioned, emphasizes experiencing the planes through the senses as much as possible. So Britlin will occasionally do charming things like lick rainwater off an old wooden floor just to see what it's like. Yasmin, on the other hand, is a member of the Doom Guard, a faction which wants to, so to speak, protect and in some cases even enhance the underlying entropy of the multiverse. The most powerful member of the group, who gets killed off early in the adventure, is a governor, a member of the Fraternity of Order. Governors are something like the physicists of Planescape. They believe the multiverse is governed by a set of rules which they try to discover. In Sigil, however, they function as the court system. And you may recall from, if you watch previous videos, that we met governors and doom guards in Zeb Cook's short stories. Another member of the group, a gnome named Weasel, is a dustman. The dustmen believe we're all already dead, and that our goal is to realize our deadness and ascend to the true death. Now, within Sigil, the dustmen are responsible for dealing with dead bodies. Then there is Kirapau, a monk of the Transcendent Order. The Transcendent Order emphasizes action without deliberation. And there's a lot of humor going on with Kirapau. The final core member of Britlin's group is Hezekiah, a Clueless. Clueless is not really a faction per se, but rather the Sigilian word for a hick or yokel. It's basically someone from a prime material plane, kind of a normal Earth-like world, who's visiting Sigil. And again, a lot of comedy surrounding this clueless Hezekiah, kind of this hick character. And we also meet characters from other factions, especially the Harmonium, who function as law enforcement within Sigil. And because of its fairly extensive treatment of Sigil and its depictions of several other planes, the novel is a really good introduction to Planescape. So whether or not it comes first chronologically, it's good to talk about first, just because it deals with so many different aspects of Planescape. And because of the author's ability with characterization and set pieces, it's also just a good adventure novel apart from its D&D setting. And because Britlin is a fully fleshed out character whose personality and emotional complexity are developed across a variety of compelling situations, there's a real poignancy, I think, underneath the spectacle and the jokes. Now, it's hard to know what impact Fire and Dust has had. It's quite possibly the most popular Planescape novel, judging from what people say online. And I also wonder if the character of Fox, a fire-obsessed wizard who's manipulated by Rivi, influenced the flaming wizard Ignis in the video game Planescape Torment. So there is that maybe small connection. I don't know if there's a real connection there, but both Planescape Torment, the famous video game, and this novel have a fire-obsessed wizard. In any case, let's wrap up this discussion of Fire and Dust with that, and next time we're going to start looking at the official Planescape novel, starting with J. Robert King's Blood Wars trilogy. So, thanks for listening, and see you in the next one.